Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our September Tuesday talk. I am William Strollo, Curator of Exhibitions at the DAR Museum. Thank you for joining us today for this talk. If this is your first time at a DAR Museum event, I encourage you to go over to our website, which is dar.org/museum, and check out some more upcoming events. We have a historic tea coming up, there are monthly lectures, and then our curators will be taking over social media starting tomorrow for Ask a Curator Day. So more information over at dar.org/museum. Today we're talking with Dr. Tiffany Momon and her work on the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, which launched late last month, end of August. If you have any questions, any point during the talk today for our guest, for Tiffany, please submit those in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen here in the Zoom webinar. Dr. Tiffany Momon is a public historian and visiting assistant professor at Sewanee, the University of the South, with years of experience participating in the preservation of community histories. Her work has taken her throughout the Southeast, organizing community-based historic preservation projects in locations such as Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the Alabama Black Belt, and the Kentucky segment of the Trail of Tears. Momon led the State of Alabama HBCU survey project, in addition to contributing to over 30 public history projects across the Southeast. Momon is the founder and co-director of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a Black digital humanities project that centers on Black craftspeople, their lives, and their contributions to the making and building of America. And you can find that archive at blackcraftspeople.org. Throughout her career, Momon has lectured on the subject of Black craftspeople at organizations such as the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, Historic Charleston Foundation, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, Winter Museum and Gardens, and others. Dr. Momon, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me today, Will.
Yeah. So for anyone not already in the know about the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, can you give us an overview of this project?
Sure. So I guess I'll start at the beginning. So what inspired this project was in 2018, I was a part of the Mesda Summer Institute study into the African American material culture of the Low Country. And my project that summer was the circa 1750 Charles Pinckney Mansion in Charleston, which unfortunately is no longer standing. But my project was to look into the enslaved master carpenter and joiner on that project, John Quash Williams. And what I found as a part of that research, mainly using notes taken by Pinckney himself, what I discovered was that not only was John Williams there working on site towards the construction of the mansion, but there was an entire enslaved workforce, and we had names for them. And so, the project that summer wrapped up, and I just kept thinking, well, if I know all of this about John Quash Williams, what else can I find out about the other enslaved men there? So I went back to the papers, did a close read, and I began to see where Pinckney was sending them out across the city of Charleston. And he would send them out to his other Charleston properties and to the properties of his friends to do carpentry and joinery work. And so from there, I just created a map and I said, well, if I know, the mansion is the starting point, where can I trace them to? And it just grew from there. And it became, if I've got these 8 men on this map, who else can I put on a map? And so it just snowballed, and here we are today, Will.
And how do you know how many people offhand you've been able to track and add into the system who've done work, who've been hired out in Charleston?
Sure. So right now, if you go to the website now, our beta version launched August 31st. Mm-hmm. And so within that version right now, there are 399 craftspeople and about 26 trades. And but the people who are waiting to go in the website that we're still working on, behind the scenes to get in, we have 700 more to go in this first round. And the way that we've planned this is that every 6 weeks we will update the website with more and more craftspeople. And the way the website works is you have the digital archive portion of the site And right now we're mainly looking at self-emancipated craftspeople. So you have the archive portion of the website that gives you the information on the craftspeople, but you also have the map portion of the website, which actually gives you a location for the craftspeople. And that location is, pulled directly from the primary source. So the runaway slave ad, people mention all sorts of things in those ads. They ran away from my plantation at on the Ashley River, or things like that. So then we began to use that information to sort of draw a closer geographical pinpoint for where those people are. And then some people we don't know a specific location other than very generally they were in Charleston, or maybe they were in Summerville, South Carolina. And so we just use general GPS coordinates for those folks.
Okay, great. So it started with John Williams and the Pinckneys hiring John Williams. Kind of grew from there. Where do you see this going? How big do you see this being? And to what extent are you hoping that this archive can grow?
Oh, Will, great question. I'm actually very excited about the project's potential. As me and my team, there are four of us. So there's me, there's Dr. Torren Gatson at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. There is Victoria Hensley, who is down at the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And there's Sarah Grill, who's a recent graduate of UNCG. And when we get together and we talk about, scaling the project in other locations that we'd like to go. Next, we will be jumping head first into Tennessee. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, so of course I'm eager to, pay some recognition to my home state. But beyond Tennessee, our next stops are Baltimore, Annapolis, and Maryland, and then we'll focus in on Virginia. So I'm excited. We have our, research agenda plotted for the next year so we can begin pulling craftspeople from those areas while also continuing to grow the information that we have on craftspeople in South Carolina.
You mentioned you've got a team of 4 people who are working on this, you and 3 others. And I believe if I read the website right, there's a way that people can submit research that they found on craftspeople. So, because you call this map, this craftspeople, this digital archive map, a living map that is subject to change and growing. So how can non-team members participate in this project?
Sure. So there are 2 ways. You could always send us an email, but through the website, we've automated this process for you. And there's actually a contribution form. And we give you the ability to attach, photographs, to maybe attach a document of some sort. Maybe you published an article on this craftsperson. You can attach that all to that contribution form, and it comes straight to us. And, if you, maybe you're a little shy, you don't want your name attached to it, we have an option where you can give us your name and we list you as the contributor of that craftsperson, or maybe you don't give us, your name, but we'll still be adding those craftspeople into the digital archive. And yeah, one of the things about this, you mentioned that it's a living project. And so we really, see ourselves as facilitators of conversations about Black craftspeople. So we would like, contributions from everyone. We enjoy having these conversations and just making sure that people know who these, craftspeople were, what they contributed, and how, ultimately it's really, the story of us, how people came together and the things that they made and the things that they did.
Mm-hmm. Kind of along those same lines, how do you see this digital archive kind of helping to inform the public on the role of Black craftspeople in the larger narrative of American history? There are a number of other databases out there. I imagine your contribution is something that we haven't seen before. So how does this contribute to that larger narrative of building the American identity?
Sure. So our digital archive centers and focuses on the lives of Black craftspeople. And that was very intentional in that we wanted to bring some humanity back to this study. So many times you go into a museum, and let's say, for example, you see a silver coffee pot on display, but often people aren't thinking about necessarily, and most of the times things like those coffee pots are attributed to a maker. But that white maker might have had a shop, and within that shop, he might have had enslaved craftspeople. And so oftentimes people aren't really thinking about, um, you know, the larger history of that shop. Who else might have contributed to the production of that coffee pot besides just the shop owner and sort of, you know, head silversmith? And so, really, we want to begin to sort of highlight that. So often, one of the things that I think about, I sort of got my start in this looking at historic architecture and period rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I always think about was, how many hands built that, what we consider to be a period room now, which was formerly in someone's home, but how many people, how many hands contributed to the construction of that project where we just, don't know. And so here, we are not just a collection of names. We're actively working to bring some humanity back to these people who have for so long been just sort of pushed to the margins of the way that we study objects and historic architecture.
Yeah, I love that idea of bringing humanity back to the architecture because, and perhaps other house museum professionals might have the same view. When I worked at a historic house museum, we always said, so the owner of the house, so and so built the house in 1753, but really, he didn't build the house. He paid the people or made the people build the house. So that fully paneled room wasn't something that he labored over day and night. That was the work of several other skilled, trained individuals who built that. And I think that's
Exactly.
like bringing their names and their perspectives and their lives back into this. It's not just so and so's house; it's a group of people's house in a sense.
Exactly. One of the sort of the best examples I can think of what you just mentioned within the Pinckney papers. Charles Pinckney is actively sketching his house and he's giving dimensions and he's doing all of these things, but he's writing them in a contract for the Black craftsman John Quash Williams to execute. So,
Yeah.
you know.
Right. Tell me more about how you might see other institutions utilizing this database, or how other databases, like people who might be familiar with the Mesda Craftsman database, might be able to have information that is useful for your database. Is there any kind of plan for collaboration to bring in all of this information that has been done, but maybe just this research that's been done, but just kind of sitting off to the side, not really being delved into?
Sure. So Mesda's been a great supporter of the project, and we've had many conversations looking for the right way that we can collaborate with each other. Additionally, Dr. Torren Gatson, who's not here today, unfortunately, he's the guest editor of Mesda's newest edition of their journal, which focuses on African American craftspeople, and I have a piece coming out in that journal later this year. So yeah, we think about we've had very sort of general conversations about what that collaboration might look like, and that's very important because in the grand scheme of things, no one owns this particular vein of study. So it's important that we, with all of this information, collaborate with each other and inspire and really push each other to succeed.
I know the Mesda Craftsman database relies on a number of primary sources. What sort of sources are you pulling from to find information about these Black craftspeople and where they were?
Sure. So in this first go round, we specifically looked at self-emancipated Black craftspeople. I was very interested in looking at newspaper um, advertisements, and and that was very intentional. And one of the reasons behind that was because I was very curious about this idea of, like I mentioned, bringing humanity back into the study. I was very curious about this idea of craftspeople and maybe how they'd self-identify. So, runaway slave advertisements, it's all from the enslaver's point of view. But like I mentioned earlier, they're leaving a lot of information in there in those advertisements. So I was paying very close attention to how many enslaved craftspeople ran away with their own tools.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many, of course, who run away with their tools. But to me, that said something to the larger notion of how they saw themselves, because obviously their voice is absent in all of this. But I was very curious in the way that they saw themselves. If they ran away, what were they wearing when they ran away? And, often you'll have people, you'll see advertisements where it's like, he ran away with his shop apron on, or, things of that nature. So um, that was really the big push this first go around, to look at those advertisements of self-emancipated persons. But as we continue to grow, one of the things that we were very interested in was looking at communities. And so often within those advertisements, you get information that'll tell you, this person ran away, but he's got a brother that lives here, a mother that lives here, and then his father lives here. So then you begin to get a larger picture of what his family network looks like. You begin to think about where he can go, and that sort of documentation leads you just on this primary source hunt for information, because now I'm curious, well, can I find other documents from the plantation where that person was enslaved, to see what other craftspeople were there? So that often comes through and exploring, will and probate documents. But also you find, personal papers. You find ledger books. I love a nice, account ledger book. I was doing some later research into Charleston more into the 19th century, and I found in some private papers a stack of receipts. And within those receipts were the names of craftspeople that this gentleman was, he was basically he was going to enslavers and saying, can I hire your bricklayer, your carpenter, your joiner to work on my house? And so he had receipts where he'd been paying the enslavers, but within those receipts, you also have the names of the craftsperson and their trade. So it's, as we grow, it will be just a conglomeration of all types of sources. And that's really important, because one of the things that I've learned in this research is that you have to know how to read across the sources and sort of piece together a story, because so often because we're talking about people who were, the vast majority were enslaved, no one's writing these things down. So we're having to, pull clues from various sources to flesh out a larger story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there are a number of sources that need to be revisited. I remember when I was doing some research on the Thomas Elf account book for Charleston. It's very easy to read through that and see who Elf is, who's purchasing furniture from Elf and where he's working, and it's easy to overlook the people who are in the shop. And I think revisiting those and not just seeing, what did a chest of drawers cost, or a bed, or how many beds did he make, and how much furniture did he turn out between, 65 and 75. And to actually stop and look and see that he had a number of enslaved craftsmen sawing wood and putting together furniture and doing all sorts of stuff. So yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for people to get out there and revisit some of those primary sources.
Definitely,
And papers
definitely.
are always fun, jumping off points.
Oh, definitely. And one of the things that I also think about, on this search for information is, you mentioned Thomas Elf. I also think about the people that you don't see. So the enslaved people who are contributing to Elf's rise, who may not necessarily be working in the shop. For example, if he's got an enslaved woman cooking all of his meals, then that means that he doesn't have to take time off from his, shop production to prepare his own food. So she's contributing to what goes on, in that shop, and contributing to, him being able to keep the place running and going. So yeah, it's, so many research questions.
Yeah, and then you can even take it a bit further into the larger industry of mahogany. Let's say, there are enslaved Africans working in the Gulf and the Yucatan Peninsula, harvesting mahogany, and that's not something Elf is doing. It's being
Right.
hauled out of the middle of the forest, the woods, and out along creeks and rivers to the ocean, where it can be brought up to Charleston and any other number of places and sold and cut up there. So there's a much bigger web of work going on than I think a lot of people realize.
Right, definitely, definitely.
Right. We had a question about how archivists might be able to assist or help. Is there some way that archivists might be able to make it easier to find Black craftspeople for research?
I would say, one of the things that I've wondered about is, the creation of finding aids and things of that nature. Our archivist who helps contribute, that contracts with the project, is named Sarah Calise. So I tend to rely heavily on her for all things archives related. But I would say, just look for silences in the archive. I think we all know that, archives, museum sites, they're not neutral. And, um, you know, people creating, people creating and putting together collections, um, maybe there were things that they overlooked due to their own biases. So I would say definitely, look for silences in the archive. Look for maybe perhaps collections that your collections that aren't as strong as others, and see how, like, maybe your collection of information on African Americans is just not that strong. So maybe that's something that you could bulk up, or and one of the things I'm always very interested in what archivists have to say, because they're the keeper of our records. And so I'd love to have these types of conversations with people who are interested in assessing their collections.
We've got another question about using what you're finding in museum labels, for example. How would you incorporate or integrate these human stories in a meaningful way in museum label copy when there's a finite amount of space to interpret an object?
Yeah, I completely understand that can be challenging, because you can only get so many words onto that label. But one of the things that I think about is, if you have an object and you can attribute it to a maker, and or maybe it's even larger. Maybe, to use the example of Thomas Elf again, maybe that object doesn't automatically get attributed to Thomas Elf. Maybe that gets attributed to Thomas Elf's shop, where he used the labor of an enslaved workforce. So I think just the addition of a few words, mention just that highlight the complexity of the stories behind these objects. There was a story that I saw on Instagram yesterday about, and the name of the museum is escaping me, but it's one of the big DC museums has an elephant on display in its lobby.
History Museum, yes.
Natural History Museum, maybe. And it just mentioned how someone had done some research on their own. They found the Black craftsperson who's responsible for tanning the hide of that elephant, but that's nowhere on the label. And when you think about that, that does that craftsperson such a disservice, to be behind the creation of an object that so many of us enjoy. So it's an obligation or a duty to work that information somehow into the label of these objects.
Yeah, and I think something that I try to remember is that labels aren't permanent. That even though I wrote something once, that history is always changing for me, and that I might do some more additional deeper research on this object and find that there's more to it than just this person, and that means the label can change.
Right.
I know people will say that there are cost prohibitive reasons for not being able to change them frequently, but it's not to say that it's not possible to change a label. Once it's written, it's not written forever. And I think also with technology these days, with people being able to explore collections online, I think there's a great opportunity to expand on those histories of that object, the interpretation of those objects. And I think the database, it sounds like this digital archive is a great way of tapping into that.
Right. And it highlights what I'm, constantly hoping that people will see is that, um, this is our shared history. This is the story of what we were able to do together. And, you are um, having these contributions, by an enslaved workforce. And that definitely forced labor, but they contributed to the creation of something. And so we shouldn't just push that to the margin because it doesn't fit into our word count for the label.
Yeah, absolutely agree. We've actually got a couple questions about gender that have come up. Have you found any gender specific trades, or have you found female craftswomen working in your searches?
Sure. So, what we are actively looking for is, when we first sort of started this and we began to refine the data, one of the things that we noticed was that, the women were mainly in trades, sewing, needlework, spinning, things of that nature. And so I put out a call to the team. Let's see if we can find a woman involved in a trade that you think a woman might not have been involved in the 18th century in South Carolina. And so that research uncovered a female brick makers on one of the Low Country's large brick plantations. And it was just sort of I was reading, I believe it was a memoir, and someone mentioned, this particular brickyard, and there were women out there. And then so I put the call out and was like, let's go find whatever we can find to tell us more story about these women who were making bricks, because that's, that was our first catch of a woman involved in something, you know, not involving sewing. And yeah, so we discovered that there were women brick makers in this brickyard. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was William Hopkins Brickyard on the Wando River,
Mm-hmm.
right outside of downtown Charleston.
Yeah. Are there any other anything else that's really surprised you during your research in looking at these runaway ads, or any other materials in the archives? Anything that's really jumped out to you that you weren't really expecting to find?
Sure. So one of the veins of research that I'm exploring right now, I mentioned I was very interested in craftspeople, taking their tools with them. But then I began to look at the other things that they were carrying with them. And so I'm always interested in people who are, the advertisements will say that they forged a past, right? Because then that person's writing, right? Or, other advertisements that say, they talked someone into writing a pass for them. But I've also come across advertisements where craftspeople have taken guns with them. So you begin to think about, well, if someone is taking a gun, you begin to think about that's someone who is who's not coming back, who may be, or trying their hardest not to come back, but someone who, if they're caught, is willing to potentially use that weapon to secure their freedom. And so that makes you begin to think about ideas of freedom and what freedom meant to these individuals, and how, there are individuals who were like, simply by any means necessary, I'm not going back to that previous life that I lived. There have also been, I think about the advertisements that also mention craftspeople and their former enslavers, because then you begin to see geographically, it provides insight into, slave sales, but you also begin to see geographically how many times they were being forced to move from place to place. And there was one very good example of a gentleman named Dublin. And Dublin was born in Philadelphia. And between Philadelphia and Charleston, he'd had 5 different enslavers, and he kept just moving further south. And then from there, you begin to think about, his contributions. I can't remember his specific trade right now, but you begin to think about his contributions at each of these locations. Not only that, but his networks to those locations. Who did he leave behind? His family, his friends, and so those are just, some of the things that have stood out to me in some of these advertisements.
Yeah. We've got a question about trades. Can you tell us which new trades will be added next to the database? Are you adding those as you find them? Are there some that you're looking for? Have you come across any coach makers, something new that you weren't really looking for?
We do have a few coach makers, I believe, coming up in the next drop of data here. I think I got 4 weeks until that drops. One of the trades that I have sort of been focusing in on and wanting to expand is like goldsmiths. So right now we have one goldsmith in the archive. And of course, like I mentioned, we're using for this first go round, we're looking at runaway slave advertisements, but he was a goldsmith in Charleston. And so now I'm curious to find more goldsmiths. But yeah, I hope that we do expand trades. I'm always looking out for more cabinet makers. I have a very strong interest in those as well. Let me see, I would also like to sort of expand our collections on women because we're working within this particular data set. I just have the inclination that when we move beyond advertisements, runaway slave advertisements into larger collections, larger primary source collections, I'm hoping to find, more women. But I think too, in looking at the data that we've pulled so far, one of the things that, potential research questions that I'm interested in exploring is just how many women versus men self-emancipated, women versus men craftspeople self-emancipated, and if those women were taking any of their children. Because I imagine, the act of self-emancipating in itself is difficult, but I imagine it's even harder if you are, taking your children with you.
Yeah. We've talked about geographically where you're looking to expand. Where are you looking on a timeline though? Are you looking just at 18th century craftspeople, 17th, 18th century, 18th, 19th? What is the scope in terms of timeline of time periods that you're looking at these craftspeople?
Sure. So we started with the South Carolina in the 18th century because that was just sort of the birth of the project itself. But as we move into Tennessee, we're looking at roughly about 1850 to 1900. So we are interested, because Tennessee, comes along much later than a state like, becomes a state much later than a state like South Carolina. But from Tennessee, we're really looking at some of those craftspeople who show up on the 1870 census, so the first census after emancipation. And, we're looking at, the dates that they give, their age, and we're asking questions of that data. So, this person's, I don't know, maybe 50. So of course he was doing this job before emancipation came in 1865. So yeah, Tennessee will be much, much later than our other geographic areas. The others, the way that we have it scaled is that we'll start early and then we'll just carry it on through as close as we can get to 1900.
Right.
So yeah, this is, you mentioned that this is a living project. It's definitely living. because we've got a lot of, people to add, a lot of years to cover.
Do you foresee any of your goals, any of your parameters changing as it goes? If you find some, abundance of Black craftspeople in a certain area or at a certain time, that's kind of beyond what you had anticipated. Do you foresee that growing, or is that just you have to really kind of cap it off somewhere and work with what you have? What are your thoughts on expanding?
Sure. The way that we've looked at it so far is, we realize that our availability to find data is going to be time dependent as well as location dependent, right? And so, for example, we started in South Carolina, and then when we moved into Tennessee, we're moving into Tennessee much later. And so, one of the things that we quickly began to recognize is that we'll have to adjust our research design for the state of Tennessee based upon what's available, and things like that. So yeah, there are adjustments that have to be made, and we just handle those on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. We've got a couple more minutes. Can you give folks an idea of just, we have a couple questions about finding women or finding people in specific trades, just how you can manipulate the information on the database, on the map maybe, to kind of find or shorten the scope of what someone might be wanting to research or look for.
Sure. So on the, if you're in the digital archive portion of the website, there, one of the things that we highlight for each craftsperson is gender. So if you're on the digital archives portion of the website, you can go to the full search option. I believe there's a link there that says find Black craftspeople. You can go to the full search option and sort of manipulate your search terms there, play with the drop down menu there. And that's one of the easiest ways to find women. Additionally, each craftsperson has a unique identifier, and it's usually the first 3 or 4 letters of the trade and a number, because they all get their own number, so we can keep up with them between the archive and the map. But if you were to, let's say, find a woman on the archive side and you wanted to see her on the map, you could search by that. You can play with the drop downs on the map. One of them is identifier. You can find her identifier that way, and select it, and she'll appear on the map for you. And then that entry on the map also includes a link that will take you back to her archival entry as well. One of the things, but we mentioned that this is the beta version of the website. So one of the things that we're closely following right now is how people interact with the website, how it works, how maybe it's not working so best, as well as it could in this regard. So we're very interested in all types of feedback. This was very much so sort of a homegrown project where I met Dr. Gatson in grad school. And I also went to grad school with Victoria Hensley, who's on the project. And really, it was just us sitting around, the 4 of us, figuring this out as we went when we first got started. And I think, I also like to mention that to people because one of the things that I've often thought about is how many other good ideas for digital humanities projects are out there, and people may be in situations similar to ours where we, being a visiting professor, I'm not, at Sewanee, I don't have the same resources available to me as, permanent hires. So, just really building this using open source platforms and things like that. I often think about how many other projects are out there in our similar situation, and just always like to encourage people, just give it a shot.
Yeah, I think that's the great thing about being able to have outside contributors. It sounds like that if you have someone who's working at an archive that has greater access to something that you may not, it's a great opportunity to pull in on that resource and build to this larger project. Yeah,
exactly. And I think about the contributions that archivists, museum curators can make. And, like I said, we're very much so here to facilitate these conversations And we'd appreciate, contributions from anyone, whether it's, an archivist, curator, maybe it's a genealogist, anyone. Yeah, we're just here to spark conversations about the subject.
Okay. And how might someone give feedback on their experience on the site?
Sure. So they can send us so there's a contact form on the site, which comes directly into our inbox, or they can send us an email at blackcraftsmanda@gmail.com.
I've got one last question from a user, and then I think we will wrap it up for today. But it's again about kind of the scope of the project, and this particular instance, the individual has found that research has found that he has an ancestor who worked in Guadalupe. Do you have any interest in, or does your research look beyond the United States, or do you know of any other efforts outside of the U.S.? So again, kind of idea of geographically, are you just sticking to the continental U.S.? Are you going to eventually expand? Are we looking again at just that fluidity of we'll see what happens as it grows?
I'm so glad that person asked that question. That's a great question. So one of the things that when we think about geographic areas, one of the things that we like to do is just to go out there and see what we can easily find. And so one of the things that I've been looking at is actually the Black craftspeople in Antigua. So I can say that, yes, we are definitely just loosely looking at what we can find, the ease of being able to find things, specifically in the Caribbean. And one of those reasons being is that, so many South Carolinians had those Caribbean connections to, whether it was, Antigua, Barbados, Jamaica. And so we've just sort of been seeing, well, what's the ease of us? It's particularly in this world where traveling to an archive is certainly not as easy as, not as easy as it used to be. But yeah, so we're, playing around with that idea, and I'm very, very hopeful that we'll get there.
Great.
But if that particular person who asked that question has a contribution, we'd love to have their contribution.
Great. And can you tell us one more time the web address for the digital archive for everyone who's still listening here?
Sure. It is blackcraftspeople.org.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany, for joining us today at our Tuesday talk, our September Tuesday talk here at the DAR Museum. It's been a pleasure talking with you about your work and the team's work on the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. And if anyone is interested in finding out more, head to that website. Also, if you want to know more about our upcoming events and programs, our website again is dar.org/museum. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Will. Thanks, everyone.